Hi, everyone, and welcome to Sustainability Matters, RSM's short clip series exploring trendy sustainability topics. My name is Nicole Mohan, and I'm the National Sustainability Lead at RSM, as well as a partner in ESG and climate services.
Hi, my name is Sam Waite, and I'm a consultant within the ESG and climate services team. Today, we will be recapping on the definition of Scope 3 emissions, why they're so challenging to measure and report, and how they're becoming a critical focus in modern sustainability and climate disclosure practices. We'll also cover some practical steps your organisation can take to improve how Scope 3 emissions are managed and integrated into decision making.
Firstly, what are Scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 emissions refer to all the indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur in a company's value chain, both upstream and downstream. These include emissions from sources not owned or controlled by the company. Examples include purchased goods and services, employee commuting, and waste disposal.
Scope 3 includes everything from the emissions created by suppliers making the products a company buys, to the carbon released when customers use and dispose of those products. In Australia, where supply chains are vast and global, measuring Scope 3 is a crucial step in managing climate impact.
Why are Scope 3 emissions so hard to measure? Scope 3 emissions are tricky to measure because they come from sources outside a company's direct control, like the emissions from suppliers, contractors, or even customers. Unlike Scope 1 and 2 emissions, you have to rely on others to provide you that accurate data.
In Australia, some companies need to report their Scope 3 emissions now, especially larger corporates under investor or regulatory pressure. But many of their suppliers might not fall under these schemes, like the Act. So, these companies have never had to calculate or share emissions data before, yet they're now a critical part of the supply chain.
What does Scope 3 emissions reporting actually involve? Scope 3 reporting is no longer just a nice to have. Under the new AASB S2 standards, large companies in Australia will soon be required to disclose material Scope 3 emissions. These align with international standards like the IFRS S2, which explicitly includes Scope 3 as part of climate-related financial disclosures. And Scope 3 covers a lot. There are 15 different categories defined under the GHG protocol.
In terms of the calculation, it depends on the data you receive. The best type is supplier-specific data, but many companies still rely on proxies, like using spend-based methods or industry averages. You'll often see tools using NGA emission factors here in Australia or international databases if local data isn't available.
Let's discuss some practical steps organizations can take to improve their Scope 3 emissions reporting. 1. Materiality. Focus on what matters most. The first step is prioritizing the categories that represent the bulk of your Scope 3 emissions. Not all 15 categories will be equally relevant to every business. To help identify which categories matter the most, we begin with a Scope 3 value chain mapping exercise. This involves working closely with internal teams to map out key upstream and downstream activities, suppliers, and customer interactions to determine where emissions are generated across the value chain. By narrowing the scope in this way, companies can focus their efforts where they'll have the biggest impact. This approach not only helps drive more meaningful reductions, but also supports clearer and more relevant reporting.
2. Supplier and consumer engagement. Collaborate for better data. A lot of Scope 3 data sits with your suppliers and consumers, and you won't get far without bringing them along on the journey. For many, this may be the first time they've been asked to provide this type of information. Build relationships, share expectations early, and consider emissions when selecting and onboarding suppliers and consumers. Education and communication are key, especially for smaller or overseas corporations who might not be familiar with Australian reporting standards. Over time, you can formalise this by requiring emissions data through contracts, tender documents, or codes of conduct.
3. Data quality. improve the way you measure. Once you have identified those material sources of Scope 3, the next step is to ensure you're using data collection methods that are appropriate for these sources. Start by understanding the quality of the data available, then choose a method that's fit for purpose. Spend-based estimates are a practical starting point, especially where data is limited. But for categories that are material, aim to transition to more accurate approaches like hybrid or supplier-specific methods that better reflect actual operations. And be transparent. Clearly document your assumptions and methodologies and data sources so stakeholders can understand how the figures were derived from and will also trust the integrity of your reporting.
4. Technology. Use tools that make it easier. Digital tools like ESG reporting platforms or carbon accounting softwares can make Scope 3 emissions tracking more manageable. They can help standardize data collection, centralize reporting, and reduce manual work. Supplier portals, blockchain solutions, and traceability platforms are also emerging as powerful ways to track upstream emissions. These technologies offer deeper visibility into multi-tiered supply chains. 5. Integration. Make it a part of how you operate. The end goal isn't just to report emissions, it's to influence decisions and outcomes across the business. Scope 3 emissions should become a part of how you evaluate suppliers, products, and strategies. That means linking emissions to procurement, product decisions, and even long-term investment planning. Leading organisations use Scope 3 emissions data not just to comply, but to actively drive emissions reductions and build climate resilience across their value chain.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Sustainability Matters. As Scope 3 becomes a mandatory part of climate disclosures in Australia, it's important for businesses to build capability, engage suppliers, and embed emissions into decision makings. If you have any questions or would like to discuss how this applies to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. See you next time.